Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took our production code and separated it from our tests, and we organized it into these neat projects like voting system.application, and their own separate test projects as well. And if you haven't watched that episode and you're wondering why exactly we separated them into these projects, go ahead and watch that video. Today we're going to pick up where we left off with the database tests class, and we're going to start using TDD to create our database, okay? Same as with the other test projects, all I'm going to do first is I'm going to get my foot for the door, and this test isn't really going to test anything that much in terms of functionality. It's just to get me started, and usually when you're beginning with TDD, I'm going to repeat myself here, is you won't just want to write silly tests sometimes just to get used to writing tests, okay? So what we're going to be doing is we're going to making sure that the counter class is going to be stored in the database, and as we have gone over, we're going to be using entity framework core for our database. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a fact using xunit. Let's go ahead and create a public void saves counter to database. Okay, let's go ahead and create our appdb context. This is something that we know we'll already need, so let's go ahead, create the ctx new appdb context. This class doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to go ahead and generate this class. I'm going to make it public as well, and as I know, I'm going to be inheriting from db context. Again, you can use your programmer's discretion, your professional discretion, knowledge, expertise to break these test-driven development rules, because you kind of know what you're going for, you know what your plan is, because you did the planning, you did the design, you know how the domain knowledge. You can break these rules, okay? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna import the packages from the sandbox EF core project into voting system.database.test project. I'm gonna put them right below here. I'm gonna put a little bit of separation between the things needed for the test and the dependencies here, because later on we'll have to remove these because we're going to be inheriting from a separate project again. This is just the things that are going to happen. Okay, so once you've added that, go ahead and add the namespace. And by the way, if you get a little warning sign that it's not resolving the packages here, you can open the terminal window. If I can find it, open command line for me. Again, this is a extension that I use. If you want the same thing, you can watch my Visual Studio 2019 setup. But essentially, you open the command prompt at the location of your project, and you go ahead and say .NET restore, okay, and that's going to restore your packages. Okay, okay, so we have the context. Let's go ahead and put it in a transaction scope. Okay, so a scope is just your brackets, right? So if we create a variable string here, we can't use this variable outside of scope, right? So that's what I mean when I say transactional scope, right? We're going to put it inside a using statement. Let's go ahead, create the using statement, and we're going to grab this line and we're going to put it in this using statement. And this is where we're going to write to the database, and then later on when we want to assert, we want to read from the database, and make sure that the counter is indeed being saved to the database. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab our context, and here we are going to grab our counters table, which we don't have, so this is what we'll have to create. Let's go ahead and type in prop, tab twice to bring out the snippet. We'll say db set and say counter here. Obviously we don't have the class because we don't have the reference to it, or I think I added it in the previous episode, just don't have it in this episode, right? So voting system.applications, let's go ahead and add a reference to this. Once that's done, you will see an additional project reference down here. So let's go ahead and grab the using voting systems.models. And by the way, what can happen sometimes is you won't actually be able to import this, or Visual Studio will tell you that it can't see this. If you're running into this issue, close your Visual Studio and open it again. That should work. Okay, let's carry on. Let's go ahead and name this counters. So now we have the counters. We can add a counter. So let's go ahead and create a new counter. that we can check against. So let's create a new counter where we will say the name is new counter, semicolon, and let's go ahead and say counter here. We're adding this counter, and then we're not gonna forget to save. Essentially, let's go ahead and save changes here. And then what we're going to do is when we extract the counter here, we'll grab the context. We will have to go to the counters and let's grab a single one. We're only expecting to have one counter in the database, right? So you use single because if there's going to be two counters in the database, it's going to crash, and I'm going to show you this in a second. Right, so we grab the counter, and the names are going to conflict, so we can rename this to something like saved counter. So for the saved counter, we want to assert that it's equal to the same name, okay? And so, yeah, let's grab the counter name and compare it to the saved counter name, right? So these should be equal. Let's go ahead and run this, and from my expectations, this is going to crash. Okay, so the test crashes. Let's go ahead and inspect why, right? So we're going to click on the test, and here we're going to take a look. So invalid operation exception. No database provider has been configured. Okay, so we're in the same situation that we've been in the entity framework basics episode where we don't have a provider. And again, as we've imported the in-memory provider here, we have it as a package for our project. We haven't actually just specified it in the options. So let's go ahead and see what we did for our program here. I mean, for our app.db context in this project. So what we did is we grabbed the onConfiguring method and we provided the use in memory database function here, and that's how we configured the name of the database. How we actually are going to be using it in the application is through providing options. We'll be providing options through the constructor. Okay, and what we actually want to do is provide a separate name of the database in the constructor as well. So each test should have a separate name. Otherwise, if the names overlap, because tests are run in parallel, what will happen is that the contents of the database can be shared, providing falsy test results. Okay. So what we will have to do is we will have to provide a object that will contain the options for the database. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to create DB context options here, and the type that we'll have to specify is app.db context. So these are the options for this DB context. Let's go ahead and just call this options. And what we'll have to do is we'll have to pass them to the base of the class, right? So we're passing them down into the DB context class. Let's go ahead and pass them here. So let me just clean this up. The problem here is that this code is breaking, right? Our test is breaking because we're not providing the DB context options. So we will have to craft our options. Let's go ahead and create the options that we should be passing. And what we need to do is we need to use a options builder. Kind of the same approach how we do here, this options builder. So let's grab the DB context options builder, so the class itself, and we'll paste it here. And because it's going to be for this type of a database, we can go ahead and specify the generic type for that. So we're going to create a new DB context options builder, and we're just going to call the same function that we called in our sandbox project, use in memory database. Okay, one thing for the name that we're going to provide, we want to use the name of keyword, and this will just grab the name of any C# like class name or method name. And what I tend to do, or what the convention tends to be, is to grab the name of the test functions that you're running in, right? So the database belongs to an individual function. Okay, so now we grab the options object, and this is what this is now. This is a DB context options object of type app.db context. It fits perfectly into this constructor. Let's go ahead and pass it. Okay, so let's go ahead and pass our options just like that, and let's run this test. Okay, so another error. Let's go ahead and see what this is. System invalid operation exception. The entity type counter requires a primary key to be defined. Okay, so again, we've seen this error before. This is because our entity counter doesn't have an ID. Now, an important decision you have to make here is, does your counter really need an ID, or is this something that the database, the entity framework requires you to have, right? So do you want your business rules to have the ID, or is it something the entity framework forces you to have, right? So this is where you have to make an educated decision. Usually it doesn't hurt that much to have an ID, as long as the business people that you work with, they can kind of use the terminology of an identifier of a counter. If you hear them say that, it probably belongs in the business rules. If it is in the specification kind of thing, if it's something that is a byproduct of entity framework, then don't include it in your business rules layer, okay? So here I'm gonna go and define the ID the same way that we did in our sandbox project through onModel creating function. Okay, so this is what I'm gonna do, and again, this is just fun to use. So we're just gonna be somewhere in the body, in the scope of the DB context. We're gonna press Alt Enter. We're gonna generate overrides, deselect all, grab the onModel configuring function, grab this, right? We're gonna remove the base because we're not configuring the base. And here, what's the options builder? And I actually grabbed the wrong function, so let's go ahead again, generate overrides, deselect all. I want the model builder on model creating. Okay, let's grab this. I'll remove the base because I don't need it. I'm going to grab the model builder. I'm going to grab the entity. The entity is going to be counter. Okay, and then I'm going to configure property ID. And because I stepped on this issue a couple of times before, I know that I need to provide a type here, right? I don't want to look stupid and run into the same error. It would seem like I never learn, but I do. I do learn from my mistakes, okay? And that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna learn from our mistakes. So we added the ID property here. Now it will be able to resolve the primary key for our entity, right? So let's run the test again. So the test passes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another counter. Let's grab this counter 2, counter name 2, and I'm just going to make sure that I add another counter here just to iterate the point of this single function that is going to throw an exception when it tries to extract. Let's run the test, and you can see that it crashes and you get an invalid operation exception. Sequence contains more than one element, right? So this is, well, this is an error that you can run into. So I'm going to remove this, and I am going to show you now. I'm basically going to demonstrate you the importance of the name. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy this whole test, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a couple of counters here. We're going to rename this to 2. Here we're just going to say toList, and just for demonstration purposes, we're not going to assert anything in this one. But however, what can happen is, because now that the databases have the identical names, this condition can crash. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our tests here. So it took me a while to replicate this issue, but essentially what will happen if you have a test that has the same name of the database and it writes to it, the other test, essentially without changing it, will share the state of the database and thus making your test fail. And usually when you run these in a pipeline, they will all run in parallel. And that's when you will really encounter these issues where you don't necessarily will encounter them in your local environment. So just make sure that you are careful with the database, especially when you might be copy-pasting this, okay? So let's go ahead and delete this test because we don't really need it here. And what I will do is I will do the same kind of foot in the door test, but for voting poll, okay? So let's go ahead and run this test just to make sure that it's passing. Cool. Let's go ahead and copy the whole test. And again, we're just going to be aware of this issue with the database names, right? And here we're going to rename this to voting saves counter to database to saves voting poll to database. And we're going to make sure that we replace the name, okay? The task delay, no longer want that there, and no longer want this here. Let's go ahead and replace the voting poll and the name. We can keep it there. New voting poll. It's going to be title instead. This we can name this poll. We're going to be saving a poll to voting polls. Let's go ahead and copy this counters so we can actually save the voting poll. Voting poll, voting polls. Okay, there we are. Now I want to extract from voting polls a single voting poll, so saved poll. And now that's what I want to compare the poll title to the saved poll title, right? So let's rename these. Okay, and again, it's a simple test. It doesn't really it doesn't really test the functionality of our program. It kind of tests the functionality of Entity Framework itself, which is not really what you want to be doing. You want to be testing your application, okay? But again, this is a foot in the door test, as I explained in the beginning. Let's see why these are actually crashing. And invalid operation exception, the entity type requires a primary key to be defined. Okay, so we're entering the same kind of error. Let's go ahead and put the ID on the voting poll, and I'll just separate them with a space, just as for the reasons I explained before. Let's go ahead and run all of our tests again. Nice. So what happens here is now that we've written this, let's go ahead and clean this up a little bit, because database tests, that's not really what we're doing. We're testing our appdb context. Let's go ahead, grab this and put appdb context tests, and actually let's do it through the renaming feature. And this window's a little bit too big. Let's go apply it. All right, appdb context. So it make sure it renames the file as well. It just helps that all the little better, right? Now, this isn't really repetition. We can kind of abstract this into its own little thing, and it's probably worth. Let's go ahead and really, it's this part here, creating the options and passing it to the constructor, right? So what we want to do is produce a new appdb context with the correct options. All right, so let's go ahead and create a public appdb context, so a function that will return, right? Create db context, and here, actually, let's not make it a lambda just yet. Let's just provide the whoop, that's wrong. The string database name, right? So we're just going to be providing a database name. Let's go ahead, grab these options here, and instead of this, we are going to pass the database name. And now we want to return a new appdb context with the options here. So let's go ahead and grab this, put this here, format this a little bit. Don't forget the semicolon, the all important. Let's go ahead, grab our create db context, and we will put this here, and we will provide the name. Oh, name of. We'll grab this name of, put this here. Okay, and now we can remove this bit. Grab the function again, and we can put it here. Let's just make sure that this works before we change the next test. Okay, and this seems to work, so let's go ahead and grab this function again. We'll remove the options here, and we'll replace the appdb context here, and we're not going to forget the all-important name of the database. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our tests again. Okay, so everything's working. Let's go ahead and actually step into creating the saving function for our interactor, right? So our voting poll interactor, it depends on the iVoting system persistence interface. So what we'll have to do is we will have to create an implementation for that interface, right? The voting system application tests isn't really concerned with having. We're using mock here to verify, to basically mock its behavior and to make sure that if it behaves how we expect it to behave, the voting poll interactor is going to perform correctly, right? So we just got to make sure that we implement the interface correctly. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a voting system persistence class. So I'm going to be creating tests for that. So in my voting system.database.tests, I'm going to create a voting system persistent tests. Okay, let's add a file, and I will delete it, and I'll just make sure to give it a .cs prefix, right? Tests.cs. Right, so I got my voting system persistent tests, and let's see what the iVoting system persistence interface actually does, right? So all it does is save voting poll to database, but that's not what it just saves the voting poll, okay? So let's go ahead and implement this interface. So saves voting poll to database. That's going to be the function, so let's go ahead and make it a fact. You don't have to always write your code in order. I almost never do. I sometimes just write the things I want to make and then kind of write the actual code functionality around it. So you can do that. You can write the facts first. You know, you are the painter here. Saves voting poll to database. Let's go ahead and implement the interface. So this is how you do it. You grab the voting system. I can't spell it. So let's grab the class name and grab this. Make sure that we alt enter and grab the namespace for this. And we'll just call this persistence. And we'll enter a new voting system persistence class. Okay. And let's go ahead and generate this type. And where did this get generated? Not in this class. It got generated right here. Let me delete it here. I just want to make sure that I am generating it in the same file, so it's a little bit easier to work on. Okay, so I generate it here. Let's go ahead and make it public. So we have the persistence here. Let's go ahead and actually, it doesn't compile yet, so we can implement the interface. We have the save voting poll. So what will have to happen is essentially we will need to provide a voting poll. So let's create a voting poll. So var, let's call poll equals new voting poll. And in here we will need to provide a title, something like title, description, desk, I'm not typing description all over again, and counters, we will provide new list of counters. We'll need a new list of counters, counter, and counter, new counter. I'll just provide the names. So for example, name equals 1. I'll have 1 counter. Let me format this a little bit and put a space here, and I'll add the second counter 2. Okay, so I have a poll that I want to save, right? I got a title to check, I got the description to check, and I got the counters to check. The ID isn't really part of this, and I don't really care about that part. That is more for Entity Framework to track it at this point. Okay, so let's grab our persistence. We're going to save voting poll, and we're going to put the poll here. Okay, nice. So we've done this, right? We need to assert something. There is nothing to assert, right? This isn't like this isn't returning anything. So what we'll have to do is we'll need to, because we know we are the developers, we kind of designed this. We know that this is going to be using our appdb context to do this stuff, right? So let's go ahead and grab our appdb context into this test space, right? I'll close all the other tabs so we only have the appdb context test file, and we're going to grab our appdb context, and this sort of functionality of create db context is going to be reused. You can imagine that we're going to be creating it the same way. So this is where what you can do is create a new class, right? So since you have a file, since you have 2 different files, appdb context tests and voting system persistent tests, let's go ahead and create a new file in a folder called infrastructure. So this is your infrastructure to test the tests, right? Infrastructure in terms of the test project itself. And here we will create a db context factory.cs, right? So this is where we're going to be creating a db context factory. We'll go into the appdb context. We'll grab this function. We'll pop it in here, and this will be a static function. Just make sure that we grab all the correct imports and remove the unnecessary namespaces. Okay. Now, when we have the db context factory, we know that it's going to be doing the creation, so we can remove the db context part, right? It's going to create db context factory, creates a db context. It kind of get the picture, right? So let's go ahead, grab the class, and remove this part of it. Using db context factory, we will grab this much to replace all the other occurring errors, just like that. And let's remove these spaces here. So this looks all right. Now what we want to do is reuse this transactional kind of database usage in our voting system persistent test, right? So when we grab our interface and when we create it, that's when we want to pass our context into the voting system persistence class. And I'm going to drop down my project here because it's a little bit hard to see. But here we have our transaction. Let's go ahead and bring in the correct namespaces. Saves voting poll to database. That's the name that we want to use here. And we're not actually going to be, doing any saving here. All we're going to do is we want to create our iVoting system persistence class. We want to pass our DB context here. So we will have to create a constructor where we have the app DB context, CTX, and let's generate a field as well so we can use it in there. And now that we have the context, what we can do is copy it as well with the same name. We can assert for the saved poll, right? So let's create our saved poll. Voting polls, we are not going to forget to include, right? If you remember when in the sandbox episode and framework basics, we go over how to grab related data. So we're going to include the counters, and we're just going to grab a single one because that's what it is. I'm going to remove the async part, and I'm just going to import link system.link. Okay, so here we'll have a saved poll with the counters. So what I want to assert is that the poll title is equal to the saved poll title, right? The same thing I want to do for description, and then for each of the counters. So counter in poll dot counters. I can just go ahead and select the name, since that's what I'm going to be comparing. X.name, so it's just going to be a collection of strings at this point, and I'm going to assert equal. I'm going to compare the name, let's rename this to name, yep, the name that it equals to the saved poll, counters, select, and again I'm just going to select the name again, x.name, right? So I'm just going to make sure that all of our initial counters that we defined here, we're going to loop through each of them, and that will make sure that all the counters that we have defined here are here. And if by any chance that we might have saved more counters that we have defined here, what we can also do is we can assert that the saved poll counters count is equal to the poll counters count. So this is the wrong way around. Let me go ahead and fix this. So I want to compare against the poll counters dot count, just like that. All right, so here I'm going to compare the count of the two. So I'm going to make sure that I haven't saved more counters than I have defined. Otherwise, that would be an error. And then I want to make sure that the name is contained within the list of counters. So I'm going to check that all the counters that I've defined have been written to the database. And this is not going to be an equal, this is going to be a contains function, right? So we expect a string to be in this list of strings. Okay, so we got this test. Let's run everything, make sure it breaks, and it will break because we haven't implemented anything, right? Okay, so we're here. We are seeing the not implemented exception. Let's go ahead and go through the motions of just using our context to grab the counters. So as I said before, this is, or have I said it? I don't know. This is just responsible for saving the database. We know that we've implemented the checking for creating our voting poll in the voting poll factory, right? So this will throw an exception. So if there are not enough counters. So, and we know the interactor is kind of taking care of that. So the logic of checking if the voting poll is correct or not doesn't belong here. So we don't need to do those kind of checks here. You don't want to be rewriting the tests, okay? So for the counters, that's not what we want to save. We want to grab the voting polls, and we want to add a voting poll, and then we just want to save changes. And what we'll usually do, because it's asynchronous operations, we will change this to async in a second, but again, this is just using your programmer's discretion, your own experience. You know that it's an input-output operation. The kind of input-output means writing to a disk or to your network driver, where it will go off and do communication, and that's usually where you need asynchronous. That's when you need concurrency. Okay, that's when you need to use await syntax. Okay, so if you're interested in that kind of content, if you don't understand that, leave a comment and I will make a video covering that. Okay, but never mind. Let's go ahead and take a look at what error we get after running the test. So system.invalidOperation the type of navigational property counters on the entity type voting poll is empty partition counter, which does not implement iCollection counters. All right, so what this is essentially saying is that the counter object needs to implement the counter's property needs to be an iCollection instead of an IEnumerable. So this is when we're going to go to the voting poll and change the IEnumerable to iCollection. Okay, this will break the constructor here, so we will have to use a new list of counter to make sure that it's still not empty or not null when the voting poll is created. We can remove the import for the link, and let's go ahead and run everything again because there are other dependencies on the voting poll. Okay, and the project doesn't build, so let's go ahead and see where this error is, and it's in the voting poll factory. So what we'll have to do here is call to list to basically convert our IEnumerable. When we call .select as a link function, it will return an IEnumerable, and then to finish enumeration or to kind of cause enumeration, we call to list. All right, so when I say cause enumeration or make it enumerate, make the list enumerate, make an IEnumerable enumerate, what that means is when we call to select, that doesn't actually perform any computation. It just sort of queues the computation. All right, it will say, all right, when we will eventually need the list, when we're actually going to check it, that's when we're going to perform this function. Up until then, we're just going to say that whatever this object is, it's just going to be a stored operation. Up until we actually need to see this list, we're not going to perform this. So you're kind of offsetting the execution of a function. Okay, but again, leave a comment if that's confusing you. Let's go ahead and run all the tests after we resolved all the compiling errors. Okay, so it's nice to know that the other functionality hasn't broken, only the functionality in terms of the database has broken. So the voting poll test, we have an invalid sequence contains more than one element. And this is actually an interesting error because we actually named our test in the voting system persistent test the same that we have named it in our AppDB context, right? So let's go ahead and instead of saves, let's say persists voting poll, and to database it doesn't matter because voting system persistence, it persists data, right? Persists means it will exist after a closure of something, right? It's persisting, it exists. All right, so let's provide this new name and let's run everything again. We are getting an error down here. Okay, so this name, I forgot it. Let's run everything again. Just kind of when you break other tests, what I usually tend to do is not finish writing the test that's breaking. I tend to go and sort of fix the regression that it's caused. Okay, so we're grabbing a different name here, and that causes all tests to pass. I'm happy that this is working. And that's pretty much it for the implementation of this interface, right? So if the manager comes up to us and he basically needs to say, right, dude, we're saving the voting poll, but we can't actually see the voting poll on our interface, right? And it's like, oh well, okay, then it's a new use case. We're gonna go ahead into our voting poll application tests, and we're gonna say, right, we actually need to extract the voting poll to be able to display it on our UI, and we're gonna write a test here, and then we're gonna go back into our AppDB context tests, not here actually, a voting system persistence, because now this will need to implement a new function. We will need to get the voting poll in a specific data type, etc. Okay, and that's generally the workflow for your test-driven development cycles. Okay. So this will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. Don't forget to join the Discord server. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment. If you have any suggestions, make sure to leave a comment. If you have anything nice to say, also leave a comment. And as always, I'll see you in the next episode.